From the Darkness Cometh the Light, or Struggles for Freedom, by Lucy Ann Delaney. Chapter 6. After the trial was over, and my mother had at last been awarded the right to own her own child, her next thought reverted to Sister Nancy, who had been gone so long and from whom we had never heard. And the greatest ambition Mother now had was to see her child Nancy. So we earnestly set ourselves to work to reach the desired end, which was to visit Canada and seek the long-lost girl. My mother being a first-class laundress and myself an expert seamstress, it was easy to procure all the work we could do and command our own prices. We found, as well as the whites, a great difference between slave and free labor, for while the first was compulsory, and therefore at the best perfunctory, the latter must be superior in order to create a demand. And realizing this fully, Mother and I expended the utmost care in our respective callings, and were well rewarded for our efforts. By exercising rigid economy and much self-denial, we at last accumulated sufficient to enable Mother to start for Canada. And oh, how rejoiced I was when that dear, overworked mother approached the time when her hard-earned and long-deferred holiday was about to begin. The uses of adversity is a worn theme, and in it there is much of weak cant, but when it is considered how much of sacrifice the poverty-stricken must bear in order to procure the slightest gratification, should it not impress the thinking mind with amazement how much of fortitude and patience the honest poor display in the exercise of self-denial? O ye prosperous, prate of the uses of adversity as poetically as you please. We, who are obliged to learn of them by bitter experience, would greatly prefer a change of surroundings. Mother arrived in Toronto 2 weeks after she left St. Louis and surprised my sister Nancy in a pleasant home. She had married a prosperous farmer who owned the farm on which they lived, as well as some property in the city nearby. Mother was indescribably happy in finding her child so pleasantly situated, and took much pleasure with her bright little grandchildren. And after a long visit returned home, although strongly urged to remain the rest of her life with Nancy. But old people are like old trees. Uproot them and transplant to other scenes, they droop and die, no matter how bright the sunshine or how balmy the breezes. On her return, Mother found me with Mrs. Elsie Thomas, where I had lived during her absence, still sewing for a livelihood. Those were the days in which sewing machines were unknown, and no stitching or sewing of any description was allowed to pass muster unless each stitch looked as if it were a part of the cloth. The art of fine sewing was lost when sewing machines were invented, and though doubtless they have given women more leisure, they have destroyed that extreme neatness in the craft which obtained in the days of long ago. Time passed happily on with us, with no event to ruffle life's peaceful stream, until 1845, when I met Frederick Turner, and in a few short months we were made man and wife. After our marriage we removed to Quincy, Illinois, but our happiness was of short duration, as my husband was killed in the explosion of the steamboat Edward Bates, on which he was employed. To my mind it seemed a singular coincidence that the boat which bore the name of the great and good man who had given me the first joy of my meagre life, the precious boon of freedom, and that his namesake should be the means of weighting me with my first great sorrow. This thought seemed to reconcile me to my grief, for that name was ever sacred, and I could not speak it without reverence. The number of killed and wounded were many, and they were distributed among friends and hospitals. My husband was carried to a friend's where he breathed his last. Telegraphs were wanting in those times, so days passed before this wretched piece of news reached me, and there being no railroads and many delays, I reached the home of my friend only to be told that my husband was dead and buried. Intense grief was mine, and my repining worried Mother greatly. She never believed in fretting about anything that could not be helped. My only consolation from her was, "Cast your burden on the Lord. My husband is down south, and I don't know where he is. He may be dead, he may be alive, he may be happy and comfortable. He may be kicked, abused, and half-starved. Your husband, honey, is in heaven, and mine, God only knows where he is." In those few words I knew her burden was heavier than mine, for I had been taught that there was hope beyond the grave, but hope was left behind when sold down south. And so I resolved to conceal my grief and devote myself to my mother, who had done so much and suffered so much for me. When we returned to St. Louis and took up the old life, minus the contentment which had always buoyed us up in our daily trials, and with an added sorrow which cast a sadness over us. But time, the great healer, taught us patience and resignation, and once more we were waiting when fortune sheds brightly her smile. There always is something to wait for the while. End of section 6. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.